The severed heads lined the mantelpiece like monstrous awards. Some still had traces of blood on their lips where he'd kissed them. The most stunning ones he kept for weeks, visiting them in his private chamber to admire their decomposing features. This wasn't some modern horror movie. This was the reality inside a French castle in the 1430s, where one of history's wealthiest noblemen collected the heads of children like others collected art. Think about this for a second. In the same era when the bodies of modern serial killers are kept, parts as souvenirs, when they feel compelled to revisit their victims even after death, when the act of killing became intertwined with sexual gratification, all these patterns we associate with 20th century monsters, they were already playing out 500 years ago in medieval France. The parallels are undeniable. The trophy keeping, the necrophilia, the careful selection of victims based on physical beauty, the use of charm and gifts to lure the innocent, even the fascination with internal organs, with bodies opening up to see what lay inside. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. This man wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was one of France's most celebrated war heroes, Marshal of France, who'd fought alongside Joan of Arc herself, the country's wealthiest nobleman, someone who commanded armies and built chapels. And for 8 years, while peasant children kept disappearing around his castles, nobody could touch him. What you are about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval justice, about how power protected monsters, and about one of the most controversial executions in history. Because when Gilles de Rais finally stood on that scaffold in October 1440, he wasn't just another criminal sentenced to death. He was about to become the center of a mystery that historians still argue about today. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. Picture northwestern France in 1404. A boy is born into unimaginable privilege. His family owns more land than some entire kingdoms. Castles dot the countryside, bearing his family's coat of arms. This is Gilles de Montmorency-Laval, who would later be known as Gilles de Rais, named after the barony he would inherit. Now, you'd think being born into such wealth would guarantee a golden childhood. But tragedy struck early and hard. When Gilles was just 11 years old, he likely watched his father die in a hunting accident. Not a clean death, either. Guy de Laval was gored by a wild boar, a brutal end that the young boy may have witnessed firsthand. His mother died shortly after, leaving him orphaned before he could even properly wield a sword. The boy fell into the care of his maternal grandfather, Gilles de Rais. And this is where the story takes its first dark turn. Because Gilles wasn't interested in raising a noble young man. He was interested in power, in wealth, and in using his grandson as an instrument for his own goals. Later, at his trial, Gilles would blame everything on this man, on the laxity of his upbringing, on being allowed to indulge every illicit act from childhood. But you won't believe what kind of man this grandfather was shaping. Gilles de Rais taught his grandson the art of violence early, not just swordplay or military tactics, though Gilles excelled at both. He taught him that taking what you want was a nobleman's right, that the weak existed to serve the strong, that money and power made you untouchable. By 16, Gilles was already showing the dual nature that would define his life. On one hand, he was brilliant, fluent in Latin, well-read, cultured. On the other, he had a temper that could explode without warning. He was impulsive, hot-headed, prone to acts of sudden violence, qualities that would serve him well on the battlefield, characteristics that would serve him terrifyingly in his private chambers. The transformation from spoiled nobleman to military hero happened fast. At just 23, Gilles found himself in the service of the Dauphin, the future King Charles VII. France was losing the 100 Years' War. The English controlled vast swaths of French territory. Morale was at rock bottom. And then something miraculous happened. A teenage peasant girl appeared at court, claiming visions from God. This is where Gilles de Rais' story intersects with one of history's most famous figures, Joan of Arc, or, as she called herself, Jeanne la Pucelle, the Maid. When she arrived, claiming God had sent her to save France, most nobles laughed. But not Gilles. He was assigned as one of her military commanders, tasked with keeping this strange, charismatic girl alive in battle. Together, they achieved the impossible. The siege of Orléans had dragged on for 6 months. The English seemed unbreakable. Then Joan and Gilles arrived with their forces. In just 4 days, they shattered the siege. 4 days. What seasoned generals couldn't do in half a year, a teenage girl and a young nobleman accomplished in less than a week, the victories kept coming. Town after town fell to their combined forces. Gilles proved himself fearless in battle, always at the front, always where the fighting was thickest. His valor earned him the highest military honor France could bestow, Marshal of France. At age 25, he was one of the youngest men ever to hold the title. But here's something most people don't realize. While Gilles was winning glory on the battlefield, something was already changing inside him. The violence of medieval warfare was extreme. Cities were sacked. Prisoners were tortured. Civilians were slaughtered. There are historians who think this constant exposure to violence awakened something dark in Gilles, something that had been lurking since those unsupervised years with his grandfather. Following his capture by the English in 1430, Joan of Arc burned at the stake in 1431. Gilles didn't try to rescue her. When she died, he didn't mourn publicly. Instead, he simply retired to his estates, one of the richest men in Europe. The war hero vanished, and he was replaced by something else. What happened next beggars belief. Gilles threw himself into spending with an abandon that shocked even the extravagant French nobility. He commissioned a play about the siege of Orléans, not just any play, but a spectacular with a cast of hundreds. He offered food and wine for free to any spectator. He maintained a personal guard of 200 men, all dressed in the finest clothes. He collected rare manuscripts, commissioned music, surrounded himself with beauty and art. But it was the chapel that really raised eyebrows. The Chapel of the Holy Innocents, built by Gilles in 1433, he personally selected the choir, all young boys with beautiful voices. The irony of that name remained a mystery until his trial. The Holy Innocents, a chapel named for the children that King Herod killed, staffed by boys hand-picked for their beauty. The spending spiraled out of control. Within a few years, this man who could have bought kingdoms was selling off his lands piece by piece. His family watched in horror as castle after castle was sold to pay for his lifestyle. Even the king issued a decree prohibiting anyone from buying Gilles' property, trying to stop him from destroying his inheritance. But Gilles found ways around it. He always found ways around the rules, and now, here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Because while Gilles was burning through his fortune in public, something monstrous was happening in private. The first whispers began in 1432, just a year after Joan of Arc's death. Parents in villages near Gilles' castles began noticing something odd. Children who went to beg at the castle gates weren't coming back. It was easy at first to explain away. Noble households often took in young servants. A boy might be recruited as a page and never return home. However, the numbers kept rising. And it wasn't just poor children who disappeared. A furrier's apprentice, borrowed by Gilles' cousin, vanished. The son of a local merchant, sent to deliver goods, never came home. The pattern was always the same. A child would approach one of Gilles' castles, Machicool, Tiffauges, champed Christian. They'd be invited inside, given food, perhaps offered work. Sometimes Gilles' servants would actively recruit them, promising positions in the great lord's household. The children would enter those stone walls and simply vanish, before I reveal what was actually happening inside those castle walls. And trust me, it's worse than you can imagine. Click subscribe if you want more dark history that they don't teach in schools. Because what's next? Well, let's just say it's not for the faint of heart. But here's what makes this even more chilling: people knew. Oh, they knew. Witnesses later testified they'd seen Gilles' employees removing small bodies. In 1437, locals watched as dozens of children's corpses were removed from one of his castles. But who was going to challenge the Marshal of France? Who was going to accuse one of the most powerful men in the country based on the word of peasants? The disappearances accelerated as Gilles' financial situation worsened. By the late 1430s, he was desperate. This is when he turned to alchemy and the occult, hoping to restore his fortune through supernatural means. He brought in priests who claimed they could summon demons. A young Italian cleric named François Prelati became his close companion, promising to help him contact a demon called Baron, who might reveal the location of hidden treasure. The rituals Prelati performed required special materials. Specifically, the demon demanded the hand, heart, eyes, and blood from an infant. Suddenly, the disappearances had a new, even more horrifying dimension. These weren't just murders, they were sacrifices, but wait, let me paint you the full picture of what was happening inside those castle walls. Because when Gilles finally confessed in 1440, what he described shocked even his judges. These weren't quick deaths. The children were hung from hooks in the ceiling until they lost consciousness. Then they'd be taken down, revived, and assured no harm would come to them. Gilles would comfort them, dry their tears, tell them it was just a game. The real horror would then begin. The children would be stripped. Gilles and his accomplices, servants like Henriette Griart and Etienne Correlot, called Poitou, would take turns. Sometimes they used a special sword, a braquemard, to slowly sever the victims' heads while they were still alive. Sometimes they'd break their necks with sticks. Sometimes they'd simply cut their throats and watch as they bled out. But it was what happened after death that truly revealed the extent of Giles's depravity. He would cut open their stomachs to admire their organs. He would kiss their dead lips. He would do things I can't even begin to describe. His confession included details so graphic that parts of the court records were censored. The most beautiful heads, as I mentioned, he kept. He'd place them on his mantelpiece and pay them regular visits, giving them kisses, talking to them, admiring their features as they decomposed. When the smell became too much, he'd have them burned and seek new additions to his collection. How many children died in those castles? Gilles himself couldn't say. When asked for a number during his trial, he said he'd lost count. The court accused him of killing 140 children. Some estimates put it as high as 200, even 800. The truth is, we'll never know. Many of the bodies were burned. Others were dumped in rivers or buried in hidden locations, but here's the question that haunts historians: how did he get away with it for so long? 8 years of children disappearing, 8 years of murders, and it might have continued indefinitely if Gilles hadn't made one crucial mistake. In May 1440, Gilles got into a dispute with a priest named Jean Le Ferron over some property. The details hardly matter. What matters is that Gilles, in his typical impulsive fashion, decided to settle the dispute his way. He gathered his men, stormed the church where Le Ferron was saying Mass, and held him captive with a sword during a church service in front of witnesses. Now he'd gone too far. Attacking a priest, violating the sanctuary of a church, these were crimes even a Marshal of France couldn't commit with impunity. The Bishop of Nantes finally had the excuse he needed to move against Gilles. But even then, they didn't arrest him for murder. The initial charges were about the assault on the priest and heresy. The Duke of Brittany sent an armed force to arrest Gilles at his castle of Machecoul in September 1440. Here's what's remarkable: Gilles surrendered without a fight. This man, who commanded 200 soldiers and could have held out in his castle for months, simply handed over his sword. It's as if he was exhausted, ready for it all to end. The trial that followed was actually 2 trials running in parallel. A secular court prosecuted him for the assault on the priest and for murder. An ecclesiastical court tried him for heresy and invoking demons. The evidence presented to both courts was horrifying. At first, Gilles was defiant. He refused to recognize the court's authority. He insulted the judges. When they read the charges, 49 articles detailing murders, sexual crimes, and demon summoning, he denied everything. The court excommunicated him. This, for a medieval nobleman, was worse than death. It meant eternal damnation. The threat of excommunication broke him. On October 15, Gilles suddenly reversed course. He apologized to the judges, recognized their authority, and said he would confess. But even then, he held back. He admitted to grievous crimes but denied the demon summoning. Then came October 20th. The public defender reminded Gilles that the court had the power to use violence to get at the truth. Just the threat was enough. Gilles agreed to make a full confession. What followed was one of the most comprehensive and horrifying admissions of guilt in legal history. Gilles spoke through tears, confessed to everything: the murders, the sexual assaults, the dismemberments, the head collecting. He described specific victims, specific methods of killing. He told them about the Italian priest prelati and the demon summoning. He admitted giving the demon children's body parts. But here's what makes his confession particularly chilling: he showed no madness, no delusion. He was lucid, articulate, precise in his descriptions. He knew exactly what he'd done. He even asked that his confession be published in French, not Latin, so common people could read it as a warning to parents. His accomplices confessed, too. Henriette Griart and Poitou talked about helping their master kill children. They told of how to dispose of bodies and clean up blood, of procuring new victims. Their testimonies matched in every crucial detail. The verdict was never in doubt. Both courts found him guilty. The ecclesiastical court convicted him of heresy and invoking demons. The secular court convicted him of murder. The sentence, death by hanging and burning. But even facing death, Gilles remained a nobleman. He asked for, and received, special privileges. He would be allowed to make a final confession and be reconciled with the church before execution. His body would be removed from the flames before being completely consumed, allowing for a Christian burial. His servants would die with him, but their bodies would be burned to ash. October 26, 1440. The day of execution arrived, grey and cold. A scaffold had been erected in a meadow outside Nantes. Huge crowds gathered, nobles, merchants, peasants. Many were parents of missing children, come to see justice done. Gilles arrived dressed in white, the color of repentance. When he spoke to the crowd, he used apparent sincerity, asking forgiveness for his deeds. He urged parents to raise their children strictly, blaming his own crimes on his lax upbringing. He seemed, by all accounts, genuinely remorseful. He asked to be executed first, before his servants. The request was granted. As he stood on the scaffold, he turned to Henriette and Poitou and told them to die bravely, to think only of salvation. Then the noose was placed around his neck. The execution was swift. Gilles de Rais, Marshal of France, war hero, monster, died by hanging as the crowd watched in silence. His body was cut down and placed on a pyre but removed before the flames could consume it entirely. He was buried in the church of the monastery of Notre Dame de Carmis in Nantes, as he'd requested. His servants died next, but their bodies were allowed to burn completely, their ashes scattered to the wind. The crowd dispersed slowly, many weeping. Whether the emotion was relief, horror, or sympathy, the chronicles don't say, but here's where the story takes one final twist. Because in the centuries since that October day, historians have begun to question, was Gilles de Rais actually guilty? Think about the evidence. No bodies were ever found in his castles during the investigation. The only physical evidence came from testimony about events that occurred in the past. His confession came only after the threat of torture and excommunication. And who benefited from his death? The Duke of Brittany, who prosecuted him, inherited all his lands. The Bishop of Nantes gained significant political power. In 1992, a French court actually held a retrial of Gilles de Rais. Examining all the evidence with modern eyes, they found him not guilty. They cited the financial motives of his accusers, the lack of physical evidence, the fact that confessions made under the threat of torture were worthless. Some historians now argue Gilles was the victim of a political conspiracy, that the charges were fabricated to seize his wealth and remove a powerful nobleman who'd become inconvenient. They point out that charges of child murder and demon summoning were common accusations against political enemies in medieval times, but others remain convinced of his guilt. They argue that the detailed confessions, matching testimonies from multiple accomplices, and widespread rumors all point to real crimes. Would multiple servants independently fabricate the same horrific details? Would hundreds of parents independently claim their children vanished at Gilles's castles? The truth is, we'll never know for certain. Medieval justice was brutal, unfair, often corrupt. Torture could make anyone confess to anything. Powerful people routinely destroyed their enemies with false accusations. But sometimes, just sometimes, the guilty were actually guilty. What we do know is this: whether Gilles de Rais was a child-murdering monster or a victim of medieval injustice, his story reveals the dark heart of an era where power made you untouchable until it didn't, where children could vanish without investigation because they were poor, where the threat of torture was justice and forced confession was truth. The execution of Gilles de Rais marked the end of one of history's most controversial figures. War hero or war criminal, patron of the arts or predatory monster, victim of conspiracy or France's first serial killer? The questions remain unanswered. The truth is buried with those children who vanished into the castle walls and never came back, but perhaps the real horror isn't whether Gilles was guilty. It's that in medieval France, someone could kill hundreds of children for 8 years before anyone in power cared enough to stop them. It's that poverty made you disposable, that noble birth made you untouchable, that justice depended not on truth, but on who had the most to gain from your death. When those flames rose around the scaffold that October day, they consumed more than just 3 men. They consumed evidence, truth, and perhaps hundreds of young lives whose stories we'll never know. The parents who gathered to watch had no doubts. They'd come for their children, for closure, for the sight of the monster who'd stolen their babies meeting his end. Ultimately, whether Gilles de Rais was guilty or innocent, his execution serves as a lesson: power corrupts, wealth protects. And sometimes, the monsters we fear most aren't hiding in the shadows. They're standing in the light, building chapels, commanding armies, and collecting the heads of children like works of art. The castle walls that once echoed with children's screams have long since crumbled. The chapels built with blood money have fallen to ruin. But the questions remain, haunting historians and fascinating us still. Because in Gilles de Rais, we see not just a medieval monster, but a reflection of our deepest capacities: the war hero and the child killer, the patron of arts and the collector of heads, the sinner who repents and the unrepentant predator. All of them were real. All of them died on that scaffold. And all of them remind us that the most terrifying monsters in history were human, all too human, hidden behind titles and wealth until the day justice, or political convenience, finally caught up with them. What do you think? Was Gilles de Rais guilty of these horrific crimes, or was he framed by those who wanted his wealth and power? Please share your thoughts in the box below. And if this dark chapter of history fascinated you, make sure you're subscribed. I've got an entire series uncovering the twisted tales that your history teachers never told you about. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.